All right, so here we are in Framework 102A interactions. So an interaction with an HTML and CSS page, it takes the form of something called a DOM event. So, John, what's the DOM?
The browser?
Yeah, pretty much. What is the DOM when I have, let's say I have some HTML and CSS, and I'm talking about that, and then I talk about like what's the difference between just the HTML and the CSS and the actual DOM?
The DOM is like the canvas or the window. That's,
yep.
Basically, rendering the HTML and CSS.
Exactly, like the living, breathing experience, right? Okay, cool. So the DOM, the thing that makes it so living and breathing is that when the page loads, there are interactions that can occur with user input. With the users in the browser, they're clicking, they're dragging, they're typing, doing all of the shit that they like to do. So then when, as a user, I load a page, it's not just that I can like interact with it with my mouse or with my keyboard. I also can sit there and wait. And there can be like a set interval in the background that's like looping and changing the page content. Or there could be a WebSocket connection and there could be chats flowing in to the page and appearing. So those are the three things that I'm aware of that can cause a page to be dynamic after load. Time passing, WebSocket events arriving, or other kinds of events that are network related or interframe related if you're doing stuff with multiple browser tabs, or an iframe. And then lastly, clicking user input events. So this is mostly, what we're going to talk about in here is mostly in the context of those like click events or user-driven events. But keep in mind that like most of the concepts are applicable to anything that changes on the page after it's loaded. And not even just in the browser, like a lot of these concepts, you're going to find that they're relatively true even in other native worlds. So if you're building a native Android app or a native iOS app, they're going to be different in the way, the syntax obviously, and in the way that things get interpreted. It'll be different than what we're doing here with the browser and Vue.js. But just keep in the back of your mind, like, if you ever are approaching a situation like that and you're going in and being like, how do I do this in React? Or how do I do this in Angular 5 or whatever? Keep in mind that like it's going to be relatively similar, and we're starting to kind of converge around this component-based idea for building user interfaces. So let's deconstruct a JavaScript function before we dive in specifically to how interactions work in the browser. And for us, let's take a look at just a JavaScript function in general. And actually, let's just take a look at a JavaScript file. So I'm going to save this to my desktop. I'm going to save it as, example.js. This is a JavaScript file. It says, hello world. And just as a quick refresher, how would I run this from the terminal? So the first thing, if you want to run it with Node, is I can type node, and then I can do /example.js, meaning in the current directory, run example.js, or pass that in as the argument to Node, which is going to run it. And that'll run it and say hello world. Another option, right, is I could make example.html, and I could open that up. Oops. All right, and I'll try to be less boring and actually type some content. As you can see, I don't have a good boilerplate plugin set up right now, but I'll say hello world in here, right? And so now if I go and I open example.html. In the browser, it just has a file URL. And remember from our talk from before, this file, that would be the protocol here. It's saying use the reading HTML from a file protocol to open this URL, which is just a file on the system. and it says hello world. So we talked about one way to run hello or example.js is to run node example.js. Another way to run it is to include it on a page as a script tag. So if I was to do scripts type equals text JavaScript, and let's say that I could just put code right here in line, or I could put src equals, and I would do example.js. So that's going to cause this script to run in the browser, and if I look at the console, I can see it running. So we talked about there's two ways to kind of get JavaScript to run. We can do it with Node, we can do it from the browser. We can actually do it with anything that has a JavaScript interpreter in it. But realistically, the two things we just discussed are the things that you'll almost always be doing. Another possibility is like you could do Sails run or Sails lift, which calls out to the script in a different way, but it's still going through the Node.js side. Or you could use like Grunt or Webpack or Gulp or one of the other asset pipelines, and you might run a task that is doing some build processing stuff. But internally, that's just using Node. And then like, I guess last but not least, you could have some kind of pre-processing setup. You could have like a PhoneGap app, and you could have some JavaScript that's in the PhoneGap app. But at the end of the day, that's just running inside of a browser in a web view inside of your PhoneGap app. You could have an Electron app, which is running some JavaScript in the context of a page for a native desktop experience on your Mac or your Windows machine. But in that case, that too will be using the browser. It'll be using WebKit internally. So you guys kind of see what I'm saying? There's two ways. There's kind of two camps. There's the browser running the JavaScript, and then there's the node running the JavaScript. So what I'm about to talk to you about right now is true for both habitats of a function, right? This is JavaScript in general. So when we talk about the difference between JavaScript and Node, just as a reminder, JavaScript is this language that can run in these two very different habitats. Whereas Node is like, it was a way of taking this language, JavaScript, which was originally designed to run in a browser habitat, and making it work in a running on the local computer kind of file system or on the server habitat. Cool. All right, so let's fiddle with our function then. So right now it just says hello world, and we can continue to have it say that, but let's see what else we can have it do. So inside of here, I'm going to define a function. Let's talk about how this file is structured first. So this example.js file, we included it on a page. So that script is basically just getting jammed in there and running at the bottom of the page. And what that means is that it's running as soon as this script tag is gotten to by the page. Like the browser is trying to build the DOM and present the DOM for us based on this HTML and CSS and JavaScript blueprints we gave it. And so in the process of trying to do that, it runs across this script tag, and it's like, oh, okay, this thing, I'll run this script. So because it works that way, what that means is that your script here is basically, like everything in this file is running on page load, or close-ish. So the difference about whether the page is loaded yet, or whether people used to call jQuery document.isReady, there's kind of like different timings that you would want, really depending on what you're trying to do at a low level. If we're building an ad script that like serves ads for Google AdSense, or we were going to build an analytics tool that's going to run on web pages and it has to be like super fast and has to not block everything, then we're going to start caring more about like making sure that the page, we're getting the optimum start time for our script. For us right now, we can rely on the framework we're using. I mean, not obviously in this example, but in the context of a Sails app with Parasails, with Vue.js, or anything like React, Angular, there's going to be some kind of event that you can hook into that will let you detect, hey, it's time to start running the page has loaded now code. So like right now, let's just assume that this is good enough for our purposes, okay? So like just dropping the code right in here is good enough. So let's try something else. So maybe we're gonna say hello world Madison, and then we wanna make that dynamic. So maybe we take this string and we clip it out and we put plus name, except we're, name is a bad example because that can be a thing. So let's just put plus full name, and let's do, I'll be hip and use let, even though it doesn't matter, and then I'll do let let full name equals Madison Blanchard. Although, what is a full name anyways? Okay, cool. So let's test that out. Be sure I didn't introduce any bugs. It says hello world Madison Blanchard. That's a good sign. Just as another reminder, we don't have to do this concatenation this way. We can be hip again if we want. And we can do this instead, and that's the same thing, right? So let's see that for ourselves. It is the same thing. So, okay, just as a reminder, the way that we got this script, example.js, the way we got this code onto the page is by including it as a script tag right here. Now let me show you the problem with this. So we have let full name equals Madison Blanchard, hello world full name. We leaked that variable. So you know how I talked about how there was two ways of running JavaScript in Node and in the browser? This problem is true regardless of where you're doing this. Well, that's not true. It's not quite the same, but you can run into this problem regardless of where you're doing it. And let's start, I guess, by showing how you can run into it regardless. So I'm going to say I have right now let full name as a local variable. But let's say that instead of that, I was going to do window.fullname. And then here I did window.fullname. So as you might expect, if I do window.fullname, it's still exposed because we've exposed a global variable this way. Now we have a global variable called fullname. And there's nothing wrong with global variables if they're specific and you know what to expect and everybody on your team is in sync about the fact that they're there and it's just part of your like productivity, right? This would not be part of our productivity. This would be leaking like a very common variable name to the global namespace. And that's not so great. In JavaScript, in the browser, window.foo is the same thing as foo. So if I do window.foo equals bar, and then I type foo, I get bar. If I type window.foo, I get bar. If I type foo equals baz, and then I type window.foo, I get baz. If I type foo, I get baz. Window is like the global object in client-side JavaScript in the browser. In Node, the same thing is represented by the word global. That's a global leak that's very visible, right? Like we saw right there that we leaked. Another global leak that's less visible is we could type full name equals Madison Blanchard with no let or var or const, and then we could try refreshing, and we could type full name, and we could see Madison Blanchard, and window.fullname is also Madison Blanchard. And just remember, that's because we leaked. Anytime when we define a variable globally, in the browser, it's the same thing as attaching it to the window. It kind of makes sense. The window is like our frame of reference. That's like our world. It's the DOM's hippocampus. Now here's the actual problem, because all that stuff is fine. This is weird, the fact that this here, let, or full name without any kind of let before it, the fact that that creates a global variable in JavaScript is worrying. Easy to do on accident, right? All you did was forgot to put a var. Nonetheless, this is the reality. And that's why we have ESLint rules that will catch stuff like this when we're inside of a directory with ESLint rules. Because that would be a, hey, you can't use, that hasn't been defined, right? That's an unknown symbol. So now here's the problem. If I do let full name, normally this should be fine. Normally, and I'll get rid of the window. Normally, you would think this wouldn't leak, and in most of the code that we write on a daily basis, this does not leak a global variable. But you can see that if I type full name, it's still leaking here. The reason for that is because let and var and const, they all use a more local concept of scope. So they're tied to either block scope or to function scope. And what that means is here, when we're in a file, basically we're not inside of any functions right now. We're just loose. We're like the very, very first thing that a baby thinks when it emerges from the womb. These thoughts are incredibly, we're very impressionable right now. Even if we say let full name, like it's gonna remember that for a long time. It's gonna become a forever kind of a memory. And I know babies don't remember everything until they're like 2 years old, but you get the idea. So how do we get around that, right? The simplest possible solution is to make an instantly invoking function expression, or an IFI, or what I like to call a pocket function, like this, and we throw it into a little pocket function, like a pocket universe. And what that does now, I'll give some more space, you guys can see this is just a function. Remember, this is just another way of writing this. It just makes you look hipper, and it avoids problems with the this keyword. So I'm going to change it back to a function, an arrow function, right? And now if I go and I refresh the browser, it correctly says Madison Blanchard, but I type the word full name, and it says full name is not defined, which is great. That's what we want. And that's because let is going up, it's block scoped, which this is a block, and so it's getting scoped to that block. Another kind of block is inside of an if statement. So I know we haven't talked much in the past about the difference between var and let and everything, but the biggest difference between var and let is that if I had done var, then I could do this, because var is like defined outside of the context of a block, okay? Whereas let, if I tried to do this with let, I'm gonna see an error. Full name is not defined, because it never makes it to line, or like when it gets to line 7, it's like, I don't know about full name, because full name died on line 6, because let only lets it go up to the block level scope. All right, so that's the reason why, regardless if we were using var or we were using let, without this instantly invoking function expression or pocket function, then we would have leaked. Okay, so we kind of just talked about, in order to get to like what is a function in JavaScript, we have to make it like this far, because we're talking about interactions right now. We're talking about interactions in the DOM specifically. What we're doing right now is kind of like building our own JavaScript framework, right? We're trying to see like what happens when the page loads. The page loads, it renders our HTML and CSS, it runs the scripts at the point when it's supposed to run them. As you guys can see right here, it hit the script tag, it ran it, great. Inside of the script tag, we defined a function, but we defined a function that immediately calls itself with no arguments. So this was just a hack to be able to make sure that we don't leak variables. So that function doesn't really count. And I'm gonna just like, from now on, everything we do is gonna be inside of this pocket function.
What does IIFE stand for?
That stands for instantly invoking function expression, meaning a self-calling function.
Yeah, so you don't have to call it for.
Well, you are calling it right here on line 12, see? Another way to write this same thing is like define the function, and then we're done defining it on line 12. On line 12 or line 8 now, we finish defining the function and then we call the function. Those extra parentheses are just there for clarity. Like another word for this is do stuff immediately. So actually, let's go ahead and change that back to an iffy, but I'm gonna go ahead and give it a name. We use non-arrow functions for various things, but one of the things you can use them for is to define a name for your function, right? So I can do... Now, here's the catch. Here's the catch about that. So I'm telling you that hesitantly because there's our instantly invoking function expression. This is the function expression, and the reason it's instantly invoking is because we're calling it with a left and a right parenthesis. But the thing about doing this and giving it a fun name is that if I refresh the page, oh, okay, so this is actually not leaking. And that's because it's a like function, it's a named function, and I guess that doesn't leak, but I wouldn't rely on that. I'll leave the name there for us for now. So this is our function. This is like code that runs when the page loads. So let's just even say that, make it real clear for ourselves. The page has loaded, probably, or like the page has loaded enough. Not all of the images might be loaded. There might still be like AJAX requests being made, and the content may not have even like fully rendered yet necessarily at this point. Luckily, frameworks help us take care of that a little bit better, but this means that just like the page is loaded, we're calling ourselves immediately, and any code we put in here won't leak global variables as long as we use let or var or const. So now the next thing we would want to do is define functions. So let's say we have a form. When someone clicks the submit button, or let's say they're focused inside of one of the text fields and they hit enter. For whatever reason, we want to submit the form. So we need to be able to listen to any kind of event or set of events that we want to trigger that behavior. So usually the way that this kind of ends up being structured is we go inside of this function and then we like bind events. So in a framework, usually this part will be declarative. So like in Vue.js, this will be a declarative thing, where you go inside of one of your Paracels page scripts and you go and you find a function named like click submit button. And by convention, we always start the name of the function with like click. So again, this isn't normally how it would work because I'm not using the framework right now. I'm just showing you guys conceptually. Okay, so click submit button might be the name of a function. And this syntax I'm using here is just a special way that you can declare functions by name. An easier way to think about it is to do this. And anytime you see me do it in let, just remember it's basically the var. Okay. And you could use const as well, but remember we just don't use const by choice to avoid being confusing because it's not necessarily a constant. So we're going to make a function called click submit button, and then let's have it log clicks. So this function is doing absolutely nothing right now. So you can see it's lighting up as yellow. And the reason it's lighting up as yellow is because it is not used anywhere. So I hover over it and I can see clicks in the little gray tray at the bottom of my screen. It says click submit button is assigned a value but never used. And that's because we're never actually calling this function. What we would do in the browser normally is find some way of binding an event. So like, you might do like when the DOM element, e.g. button, or when some DOM element with some particular selector, maybe we use the type equals submit, is clicked, then run this code, then run this function. This function being click submit button. In order to get to that point, we need some way of actually binding that in the DOM. So I'm going to walk you all through this real quick, just as kind of for visibility. You're never going to do it this way in the context of an app that has a framework already, because you're going to always want to use the framework's way of like binding events. In Vue, you actually go into the HTML itself and you add like @ click equals, right? But for us, we already kind of know how to do that, so I'm going to focus more on the concepts. We need to go say, hey browser, how do I bind a click event? So let's just, and we would actually use a submit event in this case so that we handle that case talked about before where you hit the enter key while you're focused in a text field. But let's just, for simplicity, let's just put that aside instead, and let's just use the click event. So bind click event. First thing you saw suggested was to use jQuery, and we don't have jQuery on this page right now. Plus, I wanted to show you guys the rough kind of all natural approach. And as you can see by the number of times we saw things advising us not to do this, you can see that jQuery really controlled the market for a long time in the way that all interactivity was coded on web pages. Frameworks solve so many important things, but one of the things that they solve is the fact that like the browser's way of binding events is, out of necessity, it's very compatible and rather complicated because there's a lot of different ways of doing things that have evolved over the years. Here's the vanilla way to do it. So you can use this query selector all thing as a way of doing the $sign from jQuery to be able to like, that says, hey, find things in this document that have the class of click me. And then you can say add event listener click. So, hey, now that we have those things, to all of those things, bind a new event listener for click events. And when the click event fires, run this function, do stuff. So both of our conventions have become outdated, and we haven't built new ones because we haven't needed to, because you really don't need to do this kind of direct targeting unless you're inside of a component. Like if you're going to make a custom, let's say that jQuery UI has a date picker, for example, and there's also plenty of other great date pickers out there. Bootstrap has one. And let's say you wanted to wrap up that component inside of a Vue.js component or inside of a React component. Well, in order to do that, you might have to bind your own selectors to kind of like fully abstract it out and make it compatible with the Vue world. So anyways, let's not use role and let's not use is. Let's just use the old classic data. Maybe we do data role. So this data prefix thing is something that people used to use all the time. And it's still a good go-to if you're unsure that you'll be clashing with something. Like you can pretty much name these attributes anything you want in the HTML, but if you're concerned, just start it with data and then you'll be good. Data role equals submit form. And then I'm actually going to give it a type equals button. Let's just say data role equals like say hello. And then we're going to say for our selector, data dash role equals say hello with a dash apparently. We don't need that dash. Alright, so data role equals say hello. We're going to find anything on the page like that. We might find 1,000 things. And then we're going to go to each of those 1,000 things and we're going to attach an event listener called click. And then we're going to have our little function. And I'm going to get rid of I'm going to use an arrow function, because that's what we like to do in this situation. And then I'm going to say clicked. So here, we're not even using the function we defined before yet. We'll come back to that. We're just making our own thing, and we're logging whether it was clicked. And the reason this was mad at me is because it says, hey, I don't know, window's not defined. And that's because the ESLint file I brought in is not for this environment. If I wanted to make it for the environment real quick, I could go to globals and I'll say window true. And now it knows about the window global. And I'm not using this event argument, so I'm going to ignore it. Or I guess I'll just pass it through so we can take a look at it. So now we need to actually put our button on the page. So I'm going to take our button here and I'm going to go to example.html. And I'll put it on the page. And it says, say hello, and put a BR there. Okay, so it didn't like our selector, and that's probably because the native browser doesn't support this jQuery. But now if I do sub-0, this was an array, and now I'm grabbing the first element from the array, and that should be a little bit more productive for us. So this hello world Madison Blanchard, the page is loaded enough. We didn't leak Madison Blanchard as the variable full name. That's great. And when I click say hello, it says clicked. And then it logs this bunch of crazy shit. It logs the second argument, which is what's getting passed through. And that's the native thing coming from the browser. That's telling me about what event happened. We can see that it's decided its name is probably called, or its constructor name is mouse event. This is just a dictionary with a bunch of stuff in it. You can tell me, it shows me the X and Y coordinate of my mouse. I think this is like the global coordinates of the entire screen, whereas like this was the coordinate within the window. 42 by 36 makes sense, right? Given the pixels. You can see whether I was holding the control key, whether I was holding the shift key, whether I was holding the alt key. If I was on a Windows computer, the meta key is like the little flag button. And on a Mac computer, the meta key is the command key. And there's a bunch of stuff in here, and some of it is only there for backwards compatibility, really. You also, again, in a framework situation, you're going to be dealing with like a munged version of this dictionary, in a lot of cases. I won't get into all the details of that right now. But what I want to draw attention to is how it gets bound. So you can see we're doing all this stuff to get the DOM elements. Like that's our button. We're going to say let button equal that. So that gives a reference to the living button, right? And now that we have our living button, in fact, let's call it a living button. Then we're gonna talk to that. We're gonna call a living button is just a dictionary, and it has a property on it called add event listener, which we're going to call, right? We're calling it because, remember, that's what it looks like to call something. We're calling it, and we're passing it 2 arguments. The first argument, or 3 rather. The first argument is the name of the event we want to listen to. The second argument is the function that we want to run. That's the code we want to run when the actual clicking happens. And then last but not least, we're passing in this third thing that I'm going to gloss over right now that has to do with capturing. And you should never really need to worry about that for now, or really forever. But if you're ever wondering what this third thing is, it involves the word capturing, and it involves the way that like events get fired in the browser. And there's kind of like this process where it looks like a bell curve, I guess. So like it goes like outside in to the thing you clicked, and then it goes inside out from the thing you clicked. If you're lucky, you should never have to think about this ever. If you're building something with the fidelity of like Photoshop in the browser, and you're dealing a lot with custom keyboard events, you might have to care more, but also keep in mind that at that point, the component system you're using is going to be a factor. So if you're using React or you're using Vue.js, like that'll end up kind of getting in the middle, and you probably won't be thinking about the capture argument of add event listener. But now you've heard me say capture 3 times. Hopefully it's there a little bit. So anyways, this is a function we're binding, right? We're binding this function, meaning when the click happens, run it. So now let's say that we have this function we already defined ahead of time, and it says like clicked, and that clicked has an exclamation point. So I'll put in a couple more so it's really easy to see. And now instead of running this function here, the function that we were binding before, I'm actually going to pass through this function called click submit button. And you notice I'm not calling it. There's no parentheses after it. So this is me saying whenever you see the name of a function like that with no parentheses, that's the how-to. That's me saying, like, I'm passing in how to handle the click of a submit button. In fact, this is one of those times where, like, the naming of a function can be tricky, and normally this is why we don't name these functions, because really a better name for the function is handle clicking of button. That's how we think about it as the person writing this whole code, this whole file. It's like, we have this function, and we want it to run to handle the clicking of a button. But really, the other way to think about it is just like when button is clicked. But now this function here, it's not actually, there's no guarantee that this is going to run when a button is clicked just because we named it when button is clicked, right? It totally relies on us passing it in at the right spot. But there's nothing keeping me from just using this function all over the place and like calling it directly, making it no longer having a good name, right? It's no longer just when the button is clicked. So all of that and more is why we want to have, generally you don't want to have the function defined separately. You want to have it defined like right there in the spot where it's getting attached, or have some kind of framework level convention like we do in Parasails, where you just name, okay, click button, and that function is the one that runs. So I'm gonna go ahead and stick with that convention right now, but just bear in mind this function here is actually running. It's running when we click the button, but only because we're attaching that event listener, and then inside it's just logging a log. So let's see it working. It should be working exactly the same way. I click say hello, and it says clicked 3 exclamation points. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna get rid of the word function, and I'm gonna write it a different way. John, you think that's gonna work the same way?
I think so, yeah. It's just the alternative.
You're correct. It'll work exactly the same way. And we've talked about the difference between arrow functions and non-arrow functions before, but just remember the main reason is there's 2 special keywords, one called this and one called arguments. And when you're using an arrow function, you can't use them. But the fact of the matter is you probably want to minimize your use of this anyways, unless it's part of your framework like it is in Vue.js. So just keep in mind, you can't use this, you cannot use arguments, you cannot use either one of these unless you write the word function. Or you can use it, right? But if you don't see the word function, then whatever this is applying to the parent, is applying to this, as opposed to, is applying to wherever the nearest thing that has the word function in it, the nearest function keyword. So if we've changed that to function, then this and arguments will work as expected. Otherwise, they're going to apply to this function up here. So we've seen how we can have a function that's defined separately. We can even see how like we're passing it through there. Great. Okay, so let's just quick review on functions themselves. Let's say that this function here, let's say that naming it click button and defining it as a separate function is not the greatest thing to do in the world. So let's go put it in line. There it is. Let's say that now there is some reusable logic that we've defined, where whenever, let's say when the living button is clicked, or anywhere else in the body is clicked. And I think I could just do document.body, but let's just keep it consistent here. Clicked elsewhere in the body. And man, guys, I really didn't mean for this to be about how event bubbling works in the browser, but I think it's going to kind of become that. I hope that's okay. And it is kind of related. All right, so when I click say hello, well, I'll wait to click say hello. I see hello world Madison Blanchard. I see the page is loaded enough, and now I'm here. Okay, so I'm binding two events. First, I look up the button, and I click if I click the button, it's gonna log clicks. And then if I click anywhere else in the body, it's gonna log clicked elsewhere in the body. So let's try clicking elsewhere in the body. I click. So first of all, down here, this isn't the body anymore. That's why it's not working. It's because that's technically the HTML. Or it's not even the HTML. The HTML ends there because that's as big as the content gets. Let's get some filler. There we go. Just so that we don't get too in the weeds with the details. Okay, cool. So now anywhere we click on the screen is going to be anywhere else in the body, right? So clicked elsewhere in the body 2 times, 3 times. You see that number? That's just Chrome. If it sees it trying to log exactly the same thing more than once, it just puts a little number instead of repeating itself. So click, 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 all good. So now I'll refresh the page because we've seen that works great. But now what happens when I click the button? You can see it actually fires, it says clicked first, and then it says clicked elsewhere in the body. So it's actually firing both. Like when I click on the button, not only does that fire on the button itself here, it also fires on the body because of how bubbling works in the browser. So an event doesn't stop is when it matches the first listener. So when I click say hello, it says clicked and it fires that event, but then the event keeps bubbling up. So I clicked button, but now the event has bubbled out to body. So if we wanted to get around this, the way we do that is we're going to stop propagation. So in Vue, we've already covered together how that works. So I won't do it right now. I think we just do .stop on the actual thing we're clicking. Because remember, in Vue, you wouldn't have to do any of this crap. We would just have like click equals, and we'd probably have a thing called click button, and then we would maybe say click.stop, right? That's how we would tell it that we wanted to stop propagation. But since we're just rolling our stuff by hand right now, we can't rely on that, so we actually have to do it on the JavaScript side. So the way you do it on the JavaScript side is you actually do need this event, which I'll go ahead and pass through to our logger so we can see it again. And actually, okay, I'll stop there because I want to show you guys something. So there's our event. There's a function we're going to call on this event called stop propagation. But something to keep in mind is this is just a dictionary, right? It is. It's technically a prototypal JavaScript object, meaning that it has some secrets. So it is just a dictionary for all intents and purposes, but because it's a prototypal JavaScript object, it has some secret hidden properties that we can't see right away. But we can get to them by digging in this proto business, which you should never reference in your code or anything. This is just for exploring. Here, I'll expose it as a global. Mike's fun global equals event. And I can do this in the debugger too. I'm just trying to keep it simple. So Mike's fun global. Okay, so now I'm going to do Mike's fun global, and without expanding it, I'm just going to type .stop propagation. You can be like, there it is. Look at that. It was there the whole time. What the heck? Why is it not listed in here, right? And that's because it's a prototypal object, this Mike's Fun Global, aka this event that we get. Basically, there's going to be stuff you can't see, and you can just Google how to expose all the properties if you want, and you can just loop over them. Sometimes they'll be non-enumerable, which means that you can't do a for loop and enumerate them one by one, like count them one by one, right? And in JavaScript objects, it's kind of like, it's super low level the way that you create them, where it feels real technical, kind of. You do like object.create, and you pass in like whether you want each property to be enumerable, right? And whether you want it to be visible or whatever. And like normally you would just do like foo for bar 5. So anytime you see one of these things, these prototypal JavaScript objects, it's usually from the browser itself, or it's from some framework that you're using, because it is kind of a lot of overhead to define your own objects in that way. So we have Mike's Fun Global, and we can call .stop propagation on it. It's not going to do a dang thing right now because the propagation has already happened, right? It's just, this is pointless to do, but it lets us call it as much as we want. Normally, we wouldn't even have access to this event anymore. The only reason we still had access to it in the console is because I exposed it as a global. So let's get rid of that now that we've kind of seen that the function definitely exists. And then let's remind ourselves of what's happening. So I click say hello, or first I click elsewhere in the body. But then now I'm going to refresh the page, I click say hello, it fires our handler, our listener, and then it also fires the click somewhere else in the body, and that's because of bubbling. So if we want to get around the bubbling thing, we just make it stop. So we're going to do stop propagation, and then you click, and you can see it only fires 1 now, right? Not 2. And that's because we stopped it from bubbling up to the body. This fired, and then it bubbled up to the body. But if we stop propagation here, then it will not bubble up to the body. Okay, that's event bubbling. And we've kind of like attached it with the lowest level stuff. This doesn't work in IE9, I think. Most of the time, this code would actually work in a browser. The reason to not use it is not because of browser compatibility. The reason to not use this in your application code is because it's messy as shit and you're going to forget what it is you're trying to do. And that's why it's always kind of abstracted away. The other thing is whenever you write code like this, it's kind of, imagine if you were writing like a big paper and then like you start off and you're like, so let me tell you that this paper, first of all, I'm going to tell you about this paper immediately. And then you start telling about it. And then at the very end of the paper you said, and remember how I said I was going to tell you immediately? I'm going to start telling you immediately right now. Go to sentence number 2, right? It's already kind of like messy. This kind of jumping around doesn't really like lend itself to being able to quickly understand what code is doing. Self-calling functions are probably the least heinous because at least once you've seen this before, you're like, oh, okay, I know what this means. It's a pocket function. But here, once we're inside of this and we're going forward, we hit line, we have 4, 5, 6. It's like, first we define a variable called full name. We log something, comments, whatever. We define something called living button. Now we're calling a function on living button. Now we're defining this other little function, and we don't know when this code is going to run. Imagine reading a recipe where the recipe involves like baking a cake and then you have to make the frosting. But like midway through the recipe, it breaks into like all this stuff about the frosting, and like you're like midway through beating the dry ingredients for the cake, and like you haven't even made the cake batter yet, but now it's like going on this fucking tangent about frosting, right? That's kind of the reason you don't want to write code this way when you can, or when you do write code this way, you want it to be like really recognizable. You want to be like, hey, look, I'm a pro at reading recipes. I see on here they started talking about the frosting. Like I can kind of see, I can use my text editor and I can control M back and forth between the wigglies, the curly braces. And I can see like, all right, we're going to be done with frosting on line 16. Let me just keep reading. So just bear that in mind. Like there's nothing wrong with defining functions to save yourself from like repeatable logic, but just bear in mind that anytime you define a function for any reason, you are basically going on a tangent to whoever the reader of your code is, and they're going to have to, if they're going directly to that line inside of the tangent, they're going to have to contextualize it, like how did this get run, and figure that out. Or if they're just reading through the file, they're going to have to deal with these sort of like weird detours all the time. And now compare that with data, and it's telling us all of the local data. It's got all these functions before mounted. And you see I'm collapsing them just for readability right now. But this is basically the reason why we have this level of structure, where we have like close new client modal, click new client wizard, next button. And that's so that on whether you're looking at it from here, you can see that, this is to handle a click event, and I know specifically what it's handling. And I know I'm already in the section called interactions of the code that has these big ASCII letters. It's telling me exactly what I can expect to find here. All of these things are going to be interactions, and all of these things are going to be tangents. And this is why we always put the methods section of a page script at the very bottom, because that way there's never anything on line 597 that you just aren't going to see unless you scroll all the way through all those tangents. Even if you find yourself detached from this particular way of working in Paracells with these components, or if you're rolling your own Vue components using React, whatever, something that is kind of universally true is like try to put your big, long, crazy tangents on the bottom. The same thing as if you had like an if statement and you have like if true, and then you have like, right here, if math.random is greater than 0.5, you've got like a bunch of stuff, and then you've got like a bunch more stuff underneath. A good best practice is to try to put like whatever heavier side is of the if, you want to put the heavy side down on the bottom and put the light side up on top. Like let the heavy stuff fall down, because maybe this is only like 2-3 lines, but this is like 400 lines. You don't want to accidentally miss those 2 or 3 lines, and you don't want to have to keep losing your place and scrolling back up and down, or have to like make that be the reason you switch into split screen mode or whatever. In general, this applies regardless. If there's something you can put higher up that's less and it means the same thing, even if it makes your if harder to understand. Like the difference between math.random greater than 0.5 and math.random less than or equal to 0.5, that's not nearly as confusing as like putting 400 lines of code here and then 2 lines of code afterwards. All right, we talked about event bubbling. We talked about like getting your code to run in the browser and kind of what that means. There's a lot that could be learned about the native component system that exists sort of in the browser, as far as like the shadow DOM. If you ever hear that word shadow DOM, like if I see this button here, there's some things in JavaScript like natively or in the DOM, like the text field. They're kind of like special, right? They have like built-in interactivity. So if I do input type equals text, that's going to turn into like an interactive element. And that blue outline and like that flashing, blinking caret symbol and like the little wiggly red lines to represent the misspelling, all that's coming from either the operating system or the browser. And even though my HTML only looks like input type equals text, there's clearly more going on behind the scenes there. Like someone wrote some code that makes it so that when I highlight those 4 characters and I press shift right, it goes to the right and lights up that 1 character. Whatever UI element is representing that light blue text selection color there, that's all on what you would call the shadow DOM, effectively. And it's not necessarily technically what's called the shadow DOM. I think that'll vary depending on what kind of element we're talking about. But just conceptually, whenever you hear the term shadow DOM, that's what it's referring to. It's like built-in, uneditable components provided by the browser or in the future provided by frameworks. So the shadow DOM, it is supposed to be the dark internal side of the browser. Like it's talking about what's going on inside of this input, basically, that we can't see. It also is extensible by design. So there's actually a whole like attached shadow thing. You can basically build elements using this new shadow DOM thing, and I'm not going to go into how to do that right now. The reason I brought it up is because like what the structure we're talking about, where like you have code that runs when the page starts, and then you have code that runs when some event happens. Like that is it. That's basically interactivity in not even in the DOM, just like in anything. Like if I was going to build a custom tablet, I was going to build it out of hardware, and I was going to build my own operating system, and I was going to do all the things, and I make it so that whatever code I end up writing at the application level, eventually it's going to have the part that runs when whatever UI I'm trying to present loads, and then I'm going to have the part that runs when some sort of event happens. Everything else is just kind of part of those 2 buckets of code. So whenever you're looking at just like, oh man, I have to do it with vanilla JavaScript, remind yourself, those are the things that you have to build. If you can build yourself those abstractions, then you should be able to have the tools that you need to be successful in like just about any crazy framework or environment. Habitat, let's say. All right, so then let's talk about one last thing. All the stuff we've been talking about is like there's 2 responsibilities that you need to make sure whatever framework or lack of framework you're using that you need to take care of. And those are 1, getting a clean way to run code when the page loads, or when, whenever this is, it mounts itself. And this is what I'm getting to. It's not always a page, right? The second thing is like getting a clean way to run code when some event occurs, when some like user or network or time created or time triggered event occurred. So it might be a WebSocket, it might be a new chat that's causing this to happen. It might be the response from a form submission attempt you're making. Although I do like to think about that as part of one continuous thing. Mainly think about it like this. Your interactions are DOM events from a user, network events from chats, from Comet, not Ajax, from incoming server sent events or like other frames, or some time triggered event. So like something that's, if you have a set interval that's sitting there firing every 50 milliseconds, you might have some code that runs in there. So those are the different places you need to be able to handle code. There's a third thing though that like is not always a problem, but like it's really easy to gloss over this, and you'll find oftentimes that like product managers and your engineering managers and your peers will often say that you don't have to actually do it, because in the moment it rarely matters. But what will start to happen, especially when you're working in a complicated UI or you're maintaining the same code over a long period of time, is that if it comes on the page, it needs to be able to come off of the page. So there's reasons why some people would say do it every time. Like, so if you're doing a really, really hands-on automated testing and you want to be able to like mount these components and test them without there being a real browser around, like you want to basically fake the browser and test like that, I personally think it can be a waste of time, but you'll find that a lot of people will do it, and it probably adds some value on some teams. Although nice full end-to-end tests generally add a lot more value than that. Nonetheless, you may find that you need to do this sometimes. You need to mock a page. So what I'm telling you right now is it can be relevant for pages, but it's real relevant because these two things we talked about above, like getting a clean way to run code when the page loads, getting a clean way to run code when some user or network or time triggered event happens. There's, for components, the same two responsibilities exist for components, like reusable UI components. But when you're doing it for UI components, there's also a third thing that only matters sometimes, which is getting a clean way to run code when the component unmounts, i.e. destroys itself / gets destroyed. Imagine like you needed a guarantee that before you die, you have 1 day to go to your safe deposit box and you have 1 day to kind of like say goodbye to all of your loved ones, right? That's what this is. It's as if you had a way for you to be like, hold on, death, wait, I'm not ready, and then you can perform some logic. The problem is that like in a lot of cases, this is where any complicated UI starts to fall apart because it starts getting skipped or like hacked. And it's actually pretty hard. Like a lot of times you'll end up spending just as much time on number 3 as you spend on number 1, because you're trying to make sure that, okay, like if 2 of these date pickers are on the same page at the same time, will it continue to work? If the same date picker comes and then goes away and then comes back, will it work the second time it gets mounted to the page because I fucked up the unmount logic right before? Maybe I never did the unmount, and then the second time it tries to come back, it just can't come back, right? Or maybe you don't even notice that. Maybe it's like the date picker is mounted, it's unmounted. It's mounted, it's unmounted, and you don't see any problem. But the 100th time it's mounted, it's been slowly leaking right into the DOM and polluting the page. So the only our code base for the project that we've all 4 of us been working on recently would be way bigger if we didn't have like the good fortune, I guess, of having a not single page app. Since we have multiple different pages, we don't have to worry about cleaning up before navigating away because the DOM is just turned into scrap metal every time someone clicks a link. It's wasteful, it's stupid, it works great, and there's nothing wrong with it, and it's the way that everyone should build apps by default until you actually need the enhanced user experience because it makes it way easier. Anyway, but talking about components for a second, it's exactly the same idea. So in Parasails and Vue, and I'll pull up one of our components. Here's our date picker. This actually is a little crazy because it's injecting jQuery UI right there in the code. It's bringing it onto the page. So this one is not the most standard looking file because of that, but it was just a way to get all of the dependencies in one file for convenience. But here's register component. You can see inside of it, it's declaratively defined, meaning it's not like, line 25 is an imperative line of code. It says register component. But then line 26, now we're in a dictionary. Everything inside of here is declarative. We're declaring the way that we want it to work. And then it's dealing with the actual setup and teardown logic. That said, we do sometimes need special setup logic. So for us, that's before mount. And then there's even a lifecycle callback here for mounted. So this runs after the component has mounted successfully. That's kind of like our, over here in our other example we've been looking at. That's like this do stuff immediately function. That's what mounted is like. Before mount is actually saying, hey, before we draw anything, before we put any of this HTML here onto the screen, run some logic, and then we'll mount it onto the screen. So we're going to run all of this, which is mainly doing custom validations in this case, and then we're going to mount it to the screen, mount it to the DOM. Okay, and then last but not least, you can see here's before destroy. This one's actually pretty short, and it's only if it's not a mobile date picker, if it's the desktop date picker, i.e. if it's jQuery UI. Because if it's on mobile, we don't even show the date picker, we just use the native date picking UI that's built into your phone because it's more comfortable, at least on iOS. It has those little wheels that pop up from the bottom in that action sheet thing. But this says, hey, if we're not on mobile, then use jQuery to locate the date picker element and then call this date picker method on it and pass through the string destroy. That's some crazy specific thing for jQuery UI that you have to use to like unmount it from the page to finish destroying that component. So we're wrapping it in a view component to like bring it into the world of view and to play nice. Part of doing that is making sure that it gets mounted properly, making sure that it gets unmounted properly, and then making sure that all of the events that a user or other components could be trying to push into it to make sure that those events map properly onto the underlying logic of the component. I think the takeaway from that hopefully should be that when you have a page, it's basically just like there's one big component. The only major difference is that when you want to unmount the component, which can happen, when you want to unmount the page, it just gets destroyed. You just navigate somewhere else, whatever. But when a component unmounts, it might come back, and you might do other stuff on the page before you're completely done. So you got to make sure and then have clean logic to unmount the component. And I always try to think about this first from the very get-go. Like before I mess with any of the events, like if I'm going to make a component and you can like click in the component or do something in the component, none of that matters until I've successfully tested getting it on and off the page and having more than one on the page at the same time, if that's something it's designed to support. One last caveat, don't make components unless you actually need them. Components are complicated and they make everything a lot trickier to maintain. They can be good for the long term if you actually are repeating logic, and you guys have seen in the projects we've worked on, eventually components will start to exist over time. But it's really, really easy to forget that there's more than meets the eye when you're building components. That weird method you had to call in jQuery UI to close the date picker, that stuff's super easy to forget. And even if you're not using some third-party component within your own component, there's still just a lot of edge cases that we don't normally think about when we want something to be completely reusable. Like any new business requirement for a new feature, chances are it's not being envisioned with the idea of being completely and utterly interoperable and swappable with anywhere else in the UI. So as you guys are looking in the future at how do I build something with, how do I go about building this thing? I got this requirement. Just remind yourself that like it's tempting to build a reusable UI components, and it can even feel like it's going really fast. But what that can lead to over time, if you prematurely build components for stuff that don't actually need to be reusable, is you'll either burn so much time building these perfect components that you're going to move much, much slower as far as your output and what you're creating. Or you aren't going to do that more likely, and you'll miss some things. And then over the long term, those will be a constant source of bugs in your project. So just something to watch out for. Yeah, I think that's it. So that's interactivity in the real abstract kind of general sense. If you don't have a framework, I hope some of that helps kind of contextualize what you guys have learned already. And I'll be here if you have any questions. Thanks.
All right. Thanks a lot.